Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to this edition of the podcast. Now, we've just started traditionally by saying something inappropriate. Well, not me, obviously. Saying something inappropriate off camera to make me laugh. It did make me laugh. I mean, to be honest, Ralph makes me laugh more than most people. So, I mean, he could just literally sit there and do nothing, and I still want to laugh at him. Anyway, right. So sorry,
Hang on,
with him.
No, actually, at him. This is
That's him.
at is the operative word in this sentence. If I was a
Yeah.
comedian, actually, that's how I would earn my money.
Yeah.
I would just stand on
Exactly.
stage there,
Well,
we would laugh at
when
me
I
for like
when I
1
did
hour. Anyway,
when I did
carry on.
that when I did that I did a stand-up comedy course.
Yeah.
They say it was really funny that there are some people who are really good and they don't even have to say anything, and they are funny. And then there are other people who have to work at it. Someone like Peter Kay, if he just literally stood on the stage and just looked around, everyone would want to laugh. Anyway, I think that Ralph, you now. I mean, actually, in the work context, you always look very, you were always serious but ready for a laugh. I wouldn't have laughed at you then, but now, you're a little bit older, a little bit wiser.
You see, I think that this is generally true for Germans all over
See,
the world. They are sort of not very funny when they just stand there.
yeah,
They begin to be very funny when they start speaking.
absolutely, superb.
Especially in a foreign
You are
language.
you are a fantastic example of yeah.
Yeah, I think this is going wrong. Can we
Anyway.
talk about something
Right,
else, please?
So let's do this. And by the way, if anyone's watching this, just so that you know, this is on my t-shirt. This is actually a bowl of ramen. Okay, just in case, like you're thinking, what the hell is that? That is a bowl of ramen with some chopsticks sticking out. Anyway, right. So we're going to talk about some pretty heavy things today, which is why I thought we'd start with a bit of levity. So let's get miserable now, and we'll talk about two things. So first of all, we are going to be talking about whether it's right for companies to be getting ready for World War III, and I am serious about that. And the other thing that I was thinking we were going to be talking about today is, do we think that nuclear fission is a short-term fix for the long-term solution, which is nuclear fusion, which we talked about on a number of previous occasions. So, first of all, World War III. There was a really, really interesting article in the Telegraph, I think it was this week.
Yes.
And it was talking about there was an interview with a guy whose job it is to get companies ready for the unthinkable, right? And he said that there was a lot of a demand for his services in order to prepare for a potential war scenario in 2027. And what the other interesting thing about this was that it was all about it also mentioned that there are a number of joint exercises which are going to take place in 2027 with a view to there actually being a war. So, in terms of what war, well, there's a number of possibilities. Obviously, Middle East continues to be, a difficult in a difficult spot. You've then got China potentially invading Taiwan and Russia potentially, broadening its spreading its wings, shall we say, across Europe. And I think that these things which we would have mentioned before and would absolutely have got dismissed out of hand are not now. And one of the reasons that they say that 2027 is a year where things could happen is because it may be that so at the beginning of 2027 there's the midterms in the US. That means that whichever way the election goes, there are going to be some very angry people So that's one thing. Then the other thing is that with all the European governments, we're all at the stage where everyone's committing to spending more of their GDP on defence. But that spending, it will take a while before we are all fully armed and ready. So 2027 seems like a good time to potentially launch some kind of attack. So with that rather sobering assessment in mind, and bearing in mind, obviously that guy is talking his own book because he is a consultant. He's not going to go, do you know what? I don't think anything's going to happen. You're fine. Just go down the path. It'll be fine. He's obviously talking his own game, and he was a tank commander or something. So he's obviously fairly sort of war-minded. But I think there's a confluence of things. It does sound like it could happen, and I think it's a good thing that there is preparation. But Ralph, what do you think?
Well, this is, of course, a big topic. It's as big and complicated as it is depressing that we actually have to talk about it.
Yeah.
If you think 5 years ago, we probably would have still dismissed it out of hand, more or less. Certainly 20 years ago, that sort of scenario would not have been something that we would need to talk about and seriously discuss. And the reason, of course, why that was is clear. At that time, the post-war security architecture, which has stood us in good stead for the last 70 years, I'm talking about NATO, of course, was still firmly in place, and it was designed with the United States as a backstop. I just want to remind everybody that that is the design of this. So when the United States are now talking about the fact that Europe, from their point of view, is sort of riding on the coattails of the United States, that is a unfair, I think, assessment, because from the word go, NATO was designed with the United States as a backstop, as an integral part of this security architecture. This particular part of the security architecture is now, I would argue, already gone. It is certainly diluting. And as a consequence of that, we have to take any conflict that we're seeing in the world more seriously from a point of view of a threat assessment than we previously needed to do this. When I say take seriously, what I mean by that is consider its escalatory effect more somberly. Because previously the escalation was capped, I would argue, within the NATO treaty, and now with the US receding within NATO, and perhaps I don't think they're ever going to formally leave NATO, but they don't have to. With the US receding or retrenching within NATO, the security architecture is certainly weakened. In the context of that, of course, is why we are doing all these things now, and why we are discussing all these things, and why, sadly, security consultants, such as the gentleman who is advising the corporate sector of how to navigate through potential situation of war, exist. Various things here, and we've talked about this before. The big bracket, of course, is that we are moving into a world where we, as in Europe, cannot count anymore on the United States to come to our defense, and therefore we are, I believe, very quickly realizing that the only people who can help us in this context is ourselves. And so Europe, and we discussed that before on the various episodes of the show, so I'm just going to mention it very briefly. Europe has the potential to step up and harness its own potential to become a superpower to an extent, and it just needs to actually do this. It needs to find the political will and the institutional unification to do that. And if you now look around, then we have seen indications, examples of that actually happening. We have seen Friedrich Merz, the new Chancellor of Germany, securing new special funds for the ramp up of defense spending in Germany. We have seen the European Union create such a fund as well. And we have, of course, importantly seen just recently in the last few days, the new defense spending report of the Labour Party, of the government, which is, in the words of one general, I believe, tantamount to a complete rethinking of the UK military and its strategy within the last 150 years. So we are doing things, and you can look at this in two ways, I suppose. You can say, oh dear, we are rearming, we have a renaissance of military activities, and that is a bad thing. And I don't think there is any other angle. I mean, this is a bad thing in itself. However, we, as in the UK, France, Germany, the European Union, is doing this in order to avoid a future war. So we're building up a capacity to deter other aggressors. Specifically, of course, Putin, because he is the aggressor who we are talking about here. And so that leads me to a situation then where I'm going to just talk about a few instances which have happened very recently in the context of the, well, you called it provocatively World War III, but it's not such a big provocation because journalists are picking this up now as well as the context in which we need to discuss this. And so before I go into some of these details, let me just give you my feel about what a world war is. A terrible word. It conjures up the image of the two world wars which we have tragically lived through as humanity. I haven't, of course, as a person, but as our societies in Europe have done this, and the societies in the world have done this. So for a world war to be called, for a war to be called World War, it needs to happen in several theaters simultaneously. And you mentioned the Middle East. I'm going to be simplistic now because we can't evaluate and give credit to all the various nuances here. So I would be tempted to tick the Middle East off as a theater which is not going to necessarily join into other theaters of war. So from the point of view of World War, I'm not going to think about the Middle East as a participant. And the reason is that we have seen a situation in the Middle East developing. The Middle East of today, I think, I'm going to say, is not the Middle East of 1948, where Israel declared its independence as a state. At that time, the Arab nations were more or less united against Israel. Today, they are more or less, I wouldn't say united, but they are driven by an equal adversarial stance towards Iran. And I think it is this commonly shared adversarial stance which has so far prevented a further contagion of the tragic and increasingly violent situation in Gaza, in Israel, to ripple out into the wider region. So for the purpose of this evaluation, I'm going to not believe that the Middle East would be joining, or any theater in the Middle East would be joined with other theaters around the world. Which therefore leaves, sadly, still two very big theaters, and that is Europe, unfortunately, and the Southeast Asia Sea. The Southeast Asia Sea because China might invade Taiwan, and Europe because Russia is likely to continue military incursions into various territories of Europe. That's how I'm going to say that. And so that now leads me back to, so first of all, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to sort of assess how likely it might be that we are going to get into a war where different territorial theaters are joined up strategically, and how likely it is that that might happen by 2027. And I'm just going to start with something that happened just yesterday or the day before yesterday, which is the Ukrainian attack on the strategic bombers in Russia. This is an unbelievable event, which is similar in terms of strategic planning to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, pager attack on Hezbollah. This has been in the making for 18 months or so. They have used something like 1,000 drones, which they managed to deploy uniformly or in a centralistically guided way. I don't really know what the words are here in terms of military
It was pretty
operations.
amazing, wasn't it? What they did. I think wasn't it two massive. I think it was two big trucks. They put them, put all the drones in. They parked them up at a specific place. The roof came off, and then all the drones came out.
That's correct.
I mean, it was really, pretty incredible.
Well, it is absolutely astonishing in terms of Ukrainian ingenuity. It is astonishing because what they actually also did, just as an anecdotal detail, excuse me, don't want this segment to be going on for too long, but that has impressed me. It's one thing to deploy the drones as a sort of like a swarm, where you have a drone swarm where the drones talk to each other and have collectively a communal goal, whilst being individually steerable by people. So that's one thing. That's a massive achievement. But then these drones, when they hit a bomber, they have to do severe and critical damage to the bomber. If the drone hits the tip of the wing or something, not much damage is being done. Then you can easily repair the bomber and nothing, and you will have wasted all this planning and all the expense which went into the production of the hardware which you're using. So the Ukrainians had or have several aircraft, several Russian strategic bombers in their museums of warfare. And they used these museum pieces to analyze the critical damage point of the bombers. They used AI to do it. And that is how they knew which points to target with the drone swarm.
Wow.
That is the reason why so much damage was being done. Another reason is that the Russians apparently have still not learned, to our advantage, that it is not a good thing to park the aircraft on an open airfield, wing to wing. Which is astonishing to me that they haven't learned this, because this has gone into their disadvantage several times. Anyway, so that's the reason why this happened. If the Ukrainians are to be believed, and it is likely, I believe, that they are correct by the standards of what they told us in the past about their military efforts, they were typically correct in their assessment. So if the Ukrainians are right, then the Russians have basically lost 1/3 of their strategic bomber fleet. And these cannot be replaced, certainly not easily. This is lost hardware to the Russians. These planes deploy glide bombs and they deploy cruise missiles. So this is a severe setback to the Russians and to the Russian military capability. What happens every time when the Russians suffer a military setback? They crank up the military rhetoric. In the past, they cranked up the nuclear rhetoric. Interestingly, to me, this hasn't happened this time. It has happened. It has happened as well, but it wasn't the focus. The focus of the rhetoric was actually the United Kingdom this time. We had the Russian ambassador to the UK summoned, but also giving interviews with TV journalists, and he was basically accusing the UK of being key instrumental in the direction of these attacks, because it was claimed by him that the Ukrainians couldn't have done this without intelligence from the UK. But I've read some strategic reports or analysis of this which claim that that is a baseless claim, because apparently the satellite data are free for everybody to use. Everybody knew where these bases were, where the Russians kept their bombers. And as I said before, and the Russians tend to keep their bombers sort of nicely lined up in open space. So the military analysts suggest that the claims by the UK ambassador are baseless, and yet the ambassador to the UK makes these claims. So that is an increase in the rhetoric designed, again, to deter the West from facilitating or supporting such attacks in the future. When I say the West, that's a collective term. It was directed specifically against the UK, which is seen as being one of the leaders within the European military supporting the Ukrainians. So why am I making all these points? Why am I saying all this? Well, first of all, because it is topical. But second, because we can see now where this is leading potentially. The reason that we are talking about World War III in, I believe, still a slightly exaggerating language which bears sort of the hallmarks of a bit of clickbait here. But the reason that we're talking about a wider military conflict is clearly that we are seeing this type of rhetoric emerging recurrently from Russia. And in response to this, Europe is coming together and is solidifying its industrial and military capacity in order to deter Russia from attacking a European territory which is not Ukraine. Now, that is the trend. That's why we're talking about this. But what I would also like to say is that Russia is clearly not unaffected by the effort which it has been going through in the last 3 years. The Center of Strategic Studies in Washington estimates that the death toll which Russia has suffered is now 1 million soldiers, and Ukraine 400,000. So this is a huge death toll, given that this the military the war is focused on a relatively small territory. Second, the economy of Russia is under a lot of strain, and if the Ukrainians, this is where I'm leading, if the Ukrainians were to be able to sustain their military efforts for another year into 2026, then it is likely that the Russian economy is going to suffer a strain event of such magnitude that Russia will find it more difficult to sustain the war. For a World War III scenario to happen, I think Russia would need to have time to stand back, regroup, rebuild its military and its economy, and then, after a pause, come back and attack the rest of Ukraine. Because the situation, as I'm seeing it now, is that America is sort of clearly tiring of this, and they are apparently walking away from the negotiations. If Putin feels that he can no longer sustain the war, then he would agree to some sort of peace accord, where he would get East Ukraine and West Ukraine would be, for now, be safe. If America walks away from the peace negotiations, then Putin has no real incentive to stop. But if he doesn't stop, then I think it is perhaps unlikely that he will come again in 2027. It's only when he has a pause, when he can rebuild the military, that he will come back in 2027 or at a later stage. Whichever way, I think the situation is such that we're not going to see any sustainable peace in Ukraine anytime soon, and that Russia will rebuild its economy and military over some period of time and make good or try to further its goal to rebuild some semblance of the Soviet Union. I would still think that the first targets will remain to be non-NATO countries, even within a weakened NATO, but it will certainly be focused on non-NATO countries if the UK, Germany, France, and the European Union are successful in building up its military. So the focus on 2027 is, I think, is almost healthy because it shows that we don't have that much time. But in a wider sense, I would say that Europe it's now a race. It's the race of Europe to remilitarize sufficiently to mount a potent and believable deterrent against Russia, and Russia being able to withdraw from the conflict and rebuild its economy, or rather Europe not allowing Russia to do that. And so so there we are. So World War, I would still not be too happy to say that, but the situation is probably academic, whether we call it a world war or not. The risk of military activity on European soil has increased materially and is now a clear and present danger.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think, just to bring it to a, sort of corporate level, I do think that it's a good, as a result of all this, it is worth companies thinking about it, what the effect might have on the supply chains. I mean, that's really, really important. And making sure that they're not too exposed. I think, over the last few years, what with COVID, with the invasion of Ukraine, we have really been shown the weaknesses of supply chains, which have, I suppose, happened over the years because of the spread of globalization and countries and things ending up having specific expertise in certain areas, maximizing that, and then not doing anything, to balance everything out. So I think that's one thing with regard to that, supply chains. And then the other thing is the whole, well, what's the demographic makeup of your workforce? Because if all of your workers are, let's say, I forgot what the age is, but like 18 to 41 or something like that, if all of them are that age, then you are going to be in difficulty, which actually may mean, funnily enough, quite, maybe this will be something that companies need to think about with regard to the aging workers, because I mean, this is a whole other topic, right? And it's something I feel very strongly about, that and I've always felt like this, is that society generally is ageist. Employers generally are, even if they don't think they are, they can well be, they probably are ageist, because who do you take on? If you take on you have a role, who do you take on? Let's say a 50-year-old or a 25-year-old. They're probably going to go for the 25-year-old. I mean, I suppose it depends what it is, but generally speaking, I think go for that. Now, the threat of war I've just literally thought this, but maybe this gives an extra incentive for companies to think about having older workers within their workforce, because in case we do actually go to war, they're going to be able to keep things going. But anyway, I mean, look,
now this is a hugely difficult topic to also discuss.
And
maybe we should reserve this for later episodes as well, because I wanted to mention one other aspect of the corporate angle, and this is, of course, who might benefit from this. And of course, first of all, it is clearly the armaments industry, but it's an interesting additional angle here would be to think about what's the future battlefield going to look like, because the future battlefield, or the present battlefield, already looks pretty empty before you get to it, basically. And this is because of drone warfare, and in future, increasingly robotic warfare, autonomous vehicles driving all over the battlefield, supplying soldiers in the field, etc. AI. And so I believe that it is going to be the sort of digitized part of warfare, drones, AI, software, engineers, remote control capabilities, autonomous vehicles, and to some extent robotic capability, which is going to be important in the future battlefield, and therefore commensurately the rearmament which we're going through is going to benefit industries that supply that. But then, of course, also there's going to be the traditional sort of heavy metal, the tanks and the actual warfare, which is going to happen at a later stage in a future battle. And Rheinmetall in Germany is a very important company in this field. So these companies are going to benefit from it. And last but not least, probably also building companies which build and maintain the buildings in which various capabilities are housed, and of course the barracks themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, so we've got to move on because we've literally got no time. But so let's talk about the. Do you think that nuclear fusion is a short-term fix for a long-term solution? Which nuclear? Sorry, I'll start again.
Fission.
Is nuclear fission a short-term fix for a long-term solution? Nuclear fusion.
Yeah, this is a test, actually. It's a linguistic test. Say very quickly fission or fusion 10 times
I know, yeah.
after downing.
So we've not got much time. So yes or no? No, just joking. So
no, I'm going.
Right. So yeah, I mean the reason why I asked that question is because we've got the Spain. The blackouts in Spain showed that. We're not there yet in terms of being able to supply, have good enough electricity supply. The demands of AI, the demands of AI are increasing. I mean, we saw Meta signing that agreement, and they're going to get their own personal supply of nuclear power. It's amazing, and a lot of the other big tech companies are doing it. We've got the advent of SMRs, small modular reactors coming, and then we've got countries who are actually committing to big traditional, nuclear power plants as well. But the reason why I asked that question is because I think at the same time you've got nuclear fusion going on, and I just wondered whether all this other stuff, the developments of this stuff, is all going to be almost a bit academic. Because once fusion actually comes along, then no one's going to bother with all the other stuff. But anyway, what do you think? I know you've not got very long, so
yeah. Well, we discussed fission and fusion in the past. I still believe that there has to be a transitory solution before we get commercially relevant fusion. But commercially viable fusion is something that is still pie in the sky a little bit. I know we've talked about this on the show, and it's becoming more and more real and tangible. Companies are making real breakthroughs in this. But are we confident that we're going to get commercially viable, large-scale usable electricity produced by fusion reactors all over the world, all over Europe, China, etc.? The United States? Well, I don't know. I don't believe so. I'm still skeptical. Also, it sounds a bit like a silver bullet. Let's just do this stuff and then we have fusion and then the world has no energy problems anymore. That's also unlikely to happen. So at the very least, we need to actually find a way to sustain us and tie us over until we get some form of better solution from fusion. And this is in particular going to be an issue because the need of electricity and power is ever increasing. You mentioned it, AI, data centers, electric vehicles, of course. This is going to be an ever increasing demand for electricity, which we have to service, which we have to supply. Now, therefore, clearly we have to focus on nuclear energy and also renewable energy. But the example of Spain has clearly shown where the weakness of renewable energy lies. And because renewable energy is fine and we have to do it, this is a very important part of the equation. But it is a part which doesn't always work. I've done a scientific experiment just yesterday to see whether this is actually true. And so I got up at 2 a.m. in the morning and looked outside, and the sun was not shining. This is a remarkable
Shocking.
breakthrough. The sun is not, in fact, shining at night.
Yeah.
So the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't always blowing, and this is the problem. I'm saying this as if I'm saying something new. I know everybody knows that, but the consequence, of course, is that within these dark phases, I think they're known as dark phases in the industry, you have to have other conventional energies standing by. You still have to run your coal factory, basically, in order to support and supplant the grid demand when the renewable energies are down. And although Spain is denying that this has happened, the chances are that this has exactly been the issue in Spain. So the Spanish debacle highlights precisely this issue, and therefore means that we cannot dispense with nuclear energy. We have to build this up again as quickly as we can. And then Bob's your uncle. But the reality is not going to be as easy as that, of course. One other thought which I had was that there is a third element in the equation which perhaps is not that often mentioned in the press when the press talks about this. And this again is artificial intelligence. I just want to give you one example of this. I've just recently seen a discussion in which Demis Hassabis presented recent results of their work. And apparently the AI has gone through millions of permutations in material science, meaning designing new materials with new properties. And so they have all these materials now, the sort of 1 million new materials. They don't exactly know what they're doing. So the next project is basically to program an AI to actually sift through this and find interesting materials with interesting capabilities. What Hassabis himself said is that he would like to find in that list a superconductor or a superconductive material. Quickly, as a reminder, superconductivity is something really cool. Actually, this is funny that I say cool because, well, it will become clear in just a second. It is very cool. If you think about electricity going through a wire, electricity are electrons which are going through a wire. We all know what happens when they do. They create heat. And so heat is a sort of waste material. You don't want this, but it happens. You can't not have it. And the restriction of the metal to the flow of the electrons, the name for this, as far as I understand, is impedance. And so if there's high impedance, then you have high loss. Now, the interesting thing is superconductivity happens when you cool the electric wire to a very low temperature indeed. And the interesting thing here is that as you cool it, the impedance also proportionately comes down. But when the temperature drops below a particular threshold, then the impedance falls to zero. So I really want to pause here because that's a fantastic situation. It drops to zero. Yeah, that's it. Boom. First it was non-zero, then the threshold gets crossed and it drops to zero. Done. This is, of course, fantastic because now you have a superconductive material, which means there is no restriction to the flow of electrons and there is no waste product. The problem with that is that you have to cool it down to very low temperatures, which at the moment, I believe, you can only do in the laboratory. And so the holy grail of this particular research is to find a superconductive material which is superconductive at room temperature. And this is what DeepMind is hoping to find in the list, something which is either superconductive or near superconductive. So why am I talking about all this stuff? Because it would mean that solar energy is going to become a lot more viable. Now all of a sudden you can build your solar energy plant maybe in Africa somewhere, and you can pump the electricity or you export the electricity to Europe at very low cost, which is currently not possible. And so the whole point I'm making here is that there are other technologies which AI might be instrumental in finding that make renewable energies that are currently not viable viable.
Mm.
And in doing so, there would be a more important, more commercially viable component in the energy mix, complementing nuclear energy, or the other way around, nuclear energy complementing a more viable use of renewable energies. And it is that sort of mix which might develop and then arguably be a much more believable and feasible energy mix, which will take us through to what hopefully will be commercially usable fusion energy within 10, 20 years.
Yeah, right, amazing. I mean, I think the other thing I wanted to add to that, because I know you got to go, so very quickly, I think I keep saying the other element that's really important, and I think that renewables only be truly a true solution if we can sort out energy storage. We just need, if we can hang on to more of the electricity that is generated, then that is going to mean that we'll be able to even out the flow, mean that, we're not left vulnerable. And, as more AI, as AI continues to proliferate, as more people buy electric vehicles, the demand for electricity is going to keep going up. We need to do everything all at the same time,
Yes.
because of the demand. But anyway,
absolutely.
Okay, well, look, I shall leave you to go because I know you got to go. So
I've got to run, guys. It was an
thank you very much indeed.
electrifying podcast.
Hey, very good, very good. Love it, love it. Anyway, thanks very much. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys, for having me.
Bye.
As always, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.